A few months ago I posted a picture on my Instagram and a number of you lovely lot wondered why you hadn't yet seen a video on it. So here we go. This is a 2005 Vauxhall Corsa C. The third gen Corsa ran from 2000 through 2006 and was the best selling Supermini in the UK for 4 consecutive years. So when these little things become rare, there's no doubt they'll be a symbol of the early 2000s. And they're not going to be forgotten either, not just because of how popular they were, but because of how popular they still are. The UK Corsa C forum has 71,000 members. To me, they don't capture my imagination, but it's a very logical, very good, very well designed car for the vast majority of people, aka people that don't like cars. But that's okay. The first thing I want to talk about is the styling, because I think it looks good. It's still part of that cutesy, curvy generation, but right towards the end of it, so it's sharpened up with a few swaged lines and pointy headlamps. It's clearly an evolution of the Corsa B, but it looks more grown up, more purposeful, and dare I say, more premium than the old car. The alloys fitted to this one are smart, as are the plastic arches. I'm not so keen on the drooping rear windows as they leave a massive blind spot, but to most people the aesthetics are more important. One area where safety is more important is round the back, where the Corsa goes along with a few other hatchbacks of the era by offering tail lamps up the top. Not only does that mean they're easier to see, but they keep the rear end neat and tidy as well. The units are integrated into the black section around the rear screen, as is the rear wiper. This particular Corsa is smarter thanks not only to its metallic blue paintwork, but also the body colour rubbing strips. They make the car look classier and more modern. I don't think it's as good looking as the Clio of the era, but it's a heck of a lot more individual than the ruler designed Mark VI Fiesta. And now we're inside, let's do a quick quality check, shall we? It feels built well, but the materials used not quite so much. So there's cheap plastics absolutely everywhere, and really cheap plastics by the way. The seats as well, using the cheapest materials they could possibly get. But I don't think that's too bad a thing. You see, GM seems to have struck the perfect compromise between using lower quality materials to save money, but building it really, really well. This car's 15 years old and there are no squeaks, no rattles anywhere. Everything feels really, really well screwed together, even if the materials themselves aren't perfect. But I think it's better to have it that way round. But the design itself I really like. Let's start with the doors. Now the door is just laid out really logically, it's just good. All the plastics are cheap, but at least it covers the entirety of the door. The armrest is comfy and at the right height. You've got electric windows, manually adjusted mirrors, but the mirrors themselves are really big. You've got everything you need, there's nothing really more to say about it. You also get a nice wide storage pocket as well. It's a shame then that the materials haven't quite held up. I like the dashboard. This metal effect centre here is quite smart, and all the controls are just really logically laid out. This is quite a low spec model, but it's been spec'd right. Not only does it have the metallic paint and the alloy wheels, but it also has air conditioning and the electric windows, as I mentioned before. But that's pretty much it. Above the aircon is the radio, which is one of those fitted units, so you can't nick it and put it in another car. That seemed to be a really important thing back 20 years ago. Your radio display is in this little tiny screen up here, which looks hopelessly outdated for 2020. And that's one of the most annoying things about this car. When you turn it on, every time the radio comes on. So it just has your date, the time, the temperature, and of course your radio display. The instruments, again, are just right. They're clear, concise. You've got a water temperature gauge and a fuel gauge and a digital odometer and trip. This one only has a driver's airbag, but you could get them with passenger airbags as well if you wanted to. And also on this one, you can't adjust the position of it, so it is fixed in this position. But that's fine for me, this position. The best thing about it is that you can adjust the driver's seat, so you can compensate somewhat for that. I'm about 5'10", and I've got more than enough headroom. I don't know whether you can see that or not. But the seat is very adjustable. The seats themselves, though, I'm not so sure. They are very cheap, and they're very flat as well, so you do roll around in them a bit. Also, there's very little shoulder support, so when you're on a longer drive, your shoulders tend to get a little bit achy. Also, as much as the driving position is very close, it's not quite right. There's something slightly off that's pulling my right shoulder away from the seat. I don't know whether that's the seat being angled funny or the steering wheel being angled funny. I've not yet decided, but it's one of the two. You also get radio controls on the side of the steering wheel here, which is nice, but I never use them. The stalks are the same ones used on Vauxhalls back to the 1980s, so you have your indicators on the left, you have your flash and your main beam. On the right you have your wipers, so up once for your mist, click for intermittent, up again for first speed and then second speed, pull for wash, push for your rear wiper and then push again for rear wash. The lights are down here on the right, but also the interior light is controlled by it as well. And I know that's a standard Vauxhall thing for many years, but it all seems a bit arse backwards to me. I've already touched a little bit on the controls and how the driving position feels, but it's all laid out really well. So the driving position is quite good. You have a rest for your clutch foot, and all the pedals are evenly spaced and very nice. Nicer, I must say, than the new Corsa F, which isn't perfect, to say the least. But again, the steering wheel is right in front of you, the pedals are nicely laid out, but the best thing is the gearbox, which I can't quite decide whether this is snickety or notchy, but not notchy in a bad way and not snickety in a Mazda MX-5 kind of way, but it clicks between the gears really nicely. And that's been designed in a very particular way, because the entire car has been designed to be easy to drive, so the steering is very light, the clutch is very light, and you always know when you're in the gear because it clicks into it. Now, storage, and it's a bit hit and miss, but it's more hit than it is missed. So you've got those big door pockets I mentioned, you've got a big storage area down here, you have a decent sized glove box, and there is a cup holder, but it's back here, and it's so shallow that you can't really put anything in it. There's also another little cup holder in the glove box, but again, it's not big enough to hold anything, it's too shallow and you can't get anything with height in there. There's also what looks like an ashtray here at the back, but it doesn't come out, and I don't think any of them did come with ashtrays here, so I'm not sure. But all that being said, this is actually quite a nice place to be. It's probably the nicest of its era, actually. I like the dashboard design. It seems to have stood up really well to the test of time in terms of the design. It's simple, logical, and it works. And that's becoming a bit of a theme with this car. It's not necessarily exciting or different or interesting, but it's all just right. You can tell it's been designed by people who just know how to design a decent car. Now, in the back, I am quite impressed, because despite this being a small car, and by modern standards a very small car, there is plenty of room back here. I am more than comfortable enough back here to go on quite a long journey, really. You do have headrests for the two seats, not one for the middle seat, but some of them did come with that. I don't know whether that was an option thing, a trim thing, or a year thing, no idea. But you do get an armrest as well on the right hand side, and as in the front you get a nice big storage tray as well. And despite the drooping rear windows, it still feels quite airy back here. It's actually just a nice place to be, unlike a lot of other Superminis. In a lot of small cars with a lot of room in the back, the boot space tends to lose out, but in this one the boot space is quite big. Superminis really haven't moved on in terms of practicality from this, as it's still really good. You cannot complain about the room inside. Under the skin, it follows the accepted Supermini recipe of struts at the front and a torsion beam at the back. Brakes are just as normal, with discs up front and drums at the back. It sits on the General Motors Gamma platform, shared with the Tigra and Meriva. There's an engine for pretty much everyone in these Corsas, from a 60 horsepower 1 litre 3-pot to a 125 horsepower 1.8 4-cylinder. This car has the most popular engine, the 1.2 4-banger from the General Motors Family Zero. It makes about 80 horsepower, and in a car of this weight, that's all the power you need if you're going shopping. The Family Zero engines have been very long-lived and very reliable. They've been built since 1996 and featured on Corsas until 2019, when it moved to the PSA platform. Right, let's go for a drive. The first thing you immediately notice is how light everything is. The clutch, steering, etc., it's all mega light. And yeah, that means there's very little feedback in it all, but it means it's easy to drive, and that's really the point of the car. Now, as I mentioned, the gearbox, it's not tuned for very slick, quick gear changes. It's more suited for making sure you're definitely in the gear. It's that kind of setup, but that doesn't mean that it's not nice to use, because it is quite nice to use. It's just not quite set up for snickety performance. It's more snickety to make sure you've got it in the gear. And so the gearbox itself, well, it's quite close ratioed. And what that actually means is that fifth gear is not an overdrive. And so when you are on the motorway, it can be just a little bit too loud, maybe. It's just not a cruising gearbox. But that would be okay if the engine didn't sound like it did. On my Metro, for example, and it's the only time I'm going to mention my Metro in this video, I promise, I've only got a 4-speed gearbox, and so obviously fourth isn't overdrive, so it does rev quite a bit on the motorway. But I'm okay with that because the engine is so smooth and it makes such a nice noise as well, whereas this sounds a little bit more agricultural. Yeah, it's just not quite there. This one is the 1.2 litre, 16 valve, variable intakes, etc. And it's enough engine for the car. I think the 1 litre 3-cylinder, as much as I've seen some people say that it's a really good engine, I think that might be too underpowered for this. I think this is the right amount of power for the car. If you want more, just go for the 1.4 or the 1.8. But this is more than enough. There's no way that I'm feeling this is underpowered. Yeah, the 1.2 litre, I think it's 70 horsepower. It's just more than enough. Oh, we'll give it a little bit, shall we? The steering, again, very light. Of course, as I said, that means not that much feedback through it. And there isn't that much feedback. It's not as bad as some more modern electric systems, but you just don't feel the car react. Everything that is wrong with the way this car drives is in the steering. Now, that isn't to say that it's bad. It's just that it doesn't have that edge. It doesn't have the intensity. It doesn't have the feel that you'd expect in a lot of other Superminis. But it does handle nicely. It handles cleanly. You can have fun in it, but again, that is true of all small European hatchbacks. This isn't the car you'd buy if you wanted something that excited you. It's not that kind of car. It's just all in the steering feel. It just doesn't do it. But the recipe is there. It's just that steering feel that they've not quite got. So as I come over a crest there into a corner, the steering, you don't feel it. You feel it go slightly lighter because, you know, you'd expect it to. But you don't feel the way the road surface changes. Yeah, that engine note, it's just not very inspiring. The car as a whole isn't inspiring, but that doesn't mean you can't chuck it about and have a little bit of fun, because at the end of the day, it is a small European hatchback, and so it will still go around the corners with vigour, confidence and all that kind of stuff, but you just don't get the feedback through the steering that you might expect. Of course, it will push out into understeer, but because you don't get that much feedback through the steering, the understeer can sometimes not take you by surprise, but you might have expected the grip to carry on a little bit further, maybe. This sits in a balance somewhere in between, where it doesn't ride marvellously, but it doesn't ride badly. It doesn't steer marvellously, and it doesn't steer badly. It's just somewhere in the middle. It's in that enormous grey area where a lot of cars are, frankly. I've seen a lot of reviews of this car where it gets an awful lot of flack, and while it isn't anything performance-y and it doesn't have the character of, you know, a lot of other hatchbacks, even of the era of this one, but it just does what it was designed to do, which is to just be a sensible, well-engineered, reliable, small hatchback, and it does that perfectly. the guys at Opel have just thought, yeah, we know exactly what we're doing. They've just designed a good car. It's just good. It's not characterful. It's not any better than good. But they designed a car for the people who buy these kind of cars, and the majority of people that buy cars like this aren't people like me. This feels like a car that's had a committee. Yeah, fair enough, a committee. It's not an engineer-led car by any stretch of the imagination. It's had a committee come round and say, what do we need in a car? And they've just got everything that they need. Nothing more and nothing less. Just what they need. And now, the first thing that you might say about something like this is that if it's just fine and it doesn't stand out in any way, it isn't remarkable in any way, does that make it dull? Does that make it boring? Does that make it actually a bad car just because it doesn't have that much different to offer? I don't think so. I think that just shows that it's a car that's been engineered right. Now, I can see exactly why this outsold the Fiesta. It's better looking, at least as well built, has a better looking interior, and I think it feels much roomier inside. But, and it's a big but, to drive it just feels like it was designed for people that don't like driving. And that's the problem. I like it, but I wouldn't buy one. Or a Fiesta for that matter. I'd have a Clio from this era. Most cars are compromised in one way or another, but this one feels compromised in some of the wrong places. It might look great, but I just don't love it. So there you go, a very windy look at the Corsa C. And it's not a car that I'm particularly endeared by, it's not a car that particularly excites me, and it doesn't have anything very interesting behind it, but it strikes me as the car that was just very well engineered. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, please click like and even subscribe as well if you really enjoyed it, and I'll have another video coming along soon.